a lot of questions coming in, we might move to the chat on the side. So let's see how it goes in the beginning. So just to orient you for Zoom, if you haven't renamed yourself, it looks like everybody has named themselves. Donna helped you out, change your name up on the top. You can just hover on your screen, on your video, and you'll see 3 dots up top. And if you just click that, the third option down is you can rename yourself to what you want to, how you want to be seen on the screen. It looks like everybody has their names already out, so that's great. If you don't want to speak on video, you'd rather use the chat. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that looks like a little conversation box. Just go ahead and click on that. In fact, if you do that now, click on that, that'll open it up on the side. And that way you'll be able to track all of the conversations happening if they're being typed out. And you can do that a couple different ways. You can do that to the group, or you can do it privately to other individuals within the meeting as well. A little drop-down box if you want to one person. So that's another way to continue the conversation. Lauren Scott, who's with MIG, also will be helping manage the chat. So if you do have questions that pop up that you just want to get noted, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll make sure we get back to those as we get into specific discussions. But with that, before we do introductions, any questions on Zoom? We should all be experts after 5 months of doing it, but just any questions to make sure that you're comfortable with the process and the application. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and do introductions. Start with myself. I think most of you know me, but I'm Alex Stupi. I'm with MIG, and we are the consultant project manager on this project. Very excited to be talking to you tonight. We have a lot of discussion points around scenario results, policy documentation, the survey. So we're going to talk a lot about that tonight, and excited just to have you with us on this evening. Lauren, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Lauren Scott, also with MIG, part of the consultant team, and I'll be assisting Alex with capturing any feedback given tonight as we work through everything on the agenda.
Great, thank you. Nicole, how about you?
I am Nicole Kaler, Executive Director of CDA 2030 and on the project management team.
Great, thank you, Nicole. Sean and Hillary, how about folks in your room?
Right. Just make sure I'm not on mute. Holm, City of Coeur d'Alene's Planning Department. I work on the project management team. I think everybody I see here I know, and turn it over to Woody.
Woody McEvers, City Council.
Hillary Anderson, I'm Community Planning Director. Thank you all for being here this evening.
Great, thank you. John, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, John Bruning. I was on the Planning Commission for a few years and City Council, and I retired from the Forest Service several years, about 12 years ago. And I serve on the board of directors for the Centennial Trail Foundation and for St. Vincent de Paul here in Coeur d'Alene.
Great, thank you, John. Terry.
Terry Godbout, also served on the board of the Centennial Trail Foundation for a long period of time, and I manage the We the People of Coeur d'Alene Facebook page.
Great, thank you, Terry. Julie?
I'm Julie Gibbs. I'm on the board of directors for the Museum of North Idaho.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Jeff.
My name is Jeff Voller, and I'm the Director of Operations for the Coeur d'Alene School District.
Great. Jessica.
Hi, I'm Jessica Meherin. I organize for the Civic Engagement Alliance. I'm an outreach coordinator for the North Idaho Pride Alliance.
Great, thank you. Sophia and Cookie.
I'm Cookie Allen. I am a resident here of Coeur d'Alene, and I work for the Coeur d'Alene Tribe in their Strategic Initiatives Office.
And I'm Sophia Allen. I'm a junior at CHS.
Great, thanks to both of you for coming. Tom.
Tom Messina, Planning and Zoning Commission, and been involved with this since the very beginning.
Great, thanks, Tom. Larry. Larry, can you hear us?
Lucky my phone was ringing. Guys, I'm not bashful. I just don't have a camera on my desktop. I'm Larry Riley, Executive Director of St. Vincent de Paul, and I'm also on the Jobs and Economy Focus Group.
Great, thanks, Larry. Meredith.
Hi, Meredith Little, just representing citizen in Coeur d'Alene.
Great, thank you. And there's a 617 number. Is that associated?
I think that's actually me. Sorry, I called in and also joined on my computer, so just ignore that.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure I had everybody. And then Charles. Oh, we'll get back to Charles. Looks like he's connected to the audio. Connie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Connie Krieger, and I represent the owners of the Porterra development, which has been recently included in the comprehensive plan update. And so this is the property that lies between Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls. And the City Council has approved it for inclusion in the comprehensive plan. So I'm just here tonight, actually observing the meeting. I'm not on your commission. So.
Thank you for coming, Connie. Appreciate it. Charles.
Difficulty. Hey, there I am. Sorry about that. I'm Charles Buck with the University of Idaho. Also on the board for Gizmo CDA and our local economic development court.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. Up through just the
cursor up in the corner.
Number of elements to
put it up in the corner.
So let's start off.
Click. Do you see the dots?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'll let you do it.
Sorry. Is that what we're going to talk about? There we go. All right.
So here's.
Can everybody see that?
Yes. Yep.
All right, so as I said, we do have a full agenda, a lot to talk about. So what I'd like to do is just step through the agenda. If there are any questions, changes, or additions, I'd like to just identify those now so we can make sure we save time for them. We'll review what we did at the last meeting with the Community Advisory.
So you can't hear anything at all?
No.
With the Community Advisory Committee number 3. We're going to talk about some land use scenarios that we actually started way back in September, and that we've done a lot of work on since. So we're going to show you some of those results and talk about how we refine those. We will give you a brief presentation on the community priorities survey, which we just closed about 2 weeks ago, and we had a great response, so that was good to see that. And then we're going to talk about some preliminary land use recommendations. As a part of the Envision CDA project, we will essentially be developing a land use map for the comprehensive plan as a part of that. And the scenarios and the public input to date directly tie into that. We have some questions for you as the advisory group around that to help us eventually get to what could be a preliminary recommendation as a part of this plan. And then we'll stop at the end and talk about next steps, and then we'll get you out of here right about 7 o'clock. All right, so one comment pop up here. Let me see. All right, so I just wanted to review before we get into kind of the key elements of this meeting tonight. We do have a number of groups that are working on this project. Obviously, the Community Advisory Committee one is one that you're part of, that we're meeting, and this is our 4th meeting. I mean, your primary job as a part of this committee is to help us review the policy framework that the focus groups have been working on, and we've done that at the last meeting, and we'll talk a little bit about it here, but also to really focus on land use. And that's a key component of this advisory group, is to be able to provide input and direction to the city as we develop the land use portion of the Envision Coeur d'Alene document. Many of you are also on focus groups. We have 6 focus groups that are looking at each guiding principle. We met with the focus groups for the last time yesterday and Monday to prioritize actions, make sure that process and the results of that policy framework are in line with what the community was telling us, but also to make sure that we were fact checking with those focus group members. And I'll ask people who are on focus groups to provide a summary or just a discussion about some of the things they talked about for the meeting in just a moment. But I just wanted to remind people that we do have actually 6 focus groups in addition to the advisory committee that's been working on this. all related to one another, but you do have kind of specific actions and responsibilities for each of the committees. All right. For the last CAC meeting, just as a reminder, we met back in March, and it was a Zoom. It was right at the start of COVID, so we'd intended to meet in person, and we weren't able to do that, so we switched it to a Zoom call. And we don't have notes to review from the CAC3 because we directly edited into the Google Doc, which Sean had provided to you in advance of this meeting. The summary for that meeting was essentially that we took the public survey results from January, which I'll talk about in a moment, from January, and essentially kind of tried to incorporate those into the draft policy framework to give primarily, a strong sense of what the vision is, what each of the principles are, and how those start to relate to goals and objectives. And we talked a lot about the vision and refining that through that document. So I encourage you, if you are interested in where that document stands, I'd encourage you to take a look at the PDF that Sean sent. We've made some minor revisions to it based on the last focus group meetings, but the input that we received from the CAC number 3 back in March fed directly into that policy framework that went to the public and then went through focus groups again. Any questions at all on that? Comments? All right. And Lauren, if you can help me with, I can't see my chats right now, so if you can help me with chats, that would be great. So if there's anything that comes up. Let me size this so I can see everybody. All right. All right, so with that, I'd like to open it up to the group. I know we don't have representatives from every focus group. We did meet with 6 of the 6 focus groups Monday and Tuesday. We spent over 9 hours between the 6 groups stepping through each of the policy framework actions, objectives and actions that incorporated a lot of the public input from the survey. But I wanted to open it up to the group now. If anybody who's on any of the focus groups, jobs and economy, health and safety, growth and development, environment and recreation, education and learning, community and identity, if anybody wants to provide a summary of what they talked about as a part of the focus group, we'd love to hear from you. If not, I can certainly provide a general overall summation of what those focus groups entailed. So anybody who was on in those meetings, anybody care to share what we talked about? All right, I'll do it. I'll look at it. In a nutshell, what we looked at were getting down specifically to the actions within the policy framework. When we stepped back, and looked at those, the results from the community survey that we had live in July, we had a lot of input on some objectives, but really kind of getting into the weeds on specific actions for many of those objectives within the policy framework. So we stepped through with each focus group, stepped through each goal and objective. We looked at the actions that were underneath each of those objectives. We looked at the public input related to each of those actions, and then determined whether or not the public input was already incorporated into it via existing actions, like maybe it was just reworded a little bit or we needed to make some tweaks, or if there were new actions needed based on the community input from the survey. And in general, the results from the focus groups were that the actions are pretty close for the most part to what we had with the community survey, but there were some additions here and there, some tweaks with language, some moving around of objectives to make sure that they were more in line with their friends in terms of kind of order and alignment of topic area. But I'd say 80% of the document that Sean sent you is the same document that we finished with at the end of the focus group meetings. So it's great to see, but we had almost 1,000 respondents to the survey. So I think we had a really solid, kind of review from the community for those specific actions. And that was just great to see, kind of the results and, the input that we had from that. Any comments in addition to that on the focus groups? Well, we will look forward to talking about that more as we refine it. Just in terms of next steps for the policy framework, we will continue to refine that with the focus groups no longer meeting in person or virtually. What we've promised to each of those members is that as we make those refinements and develop that preliminary draft document, we'll send that back out to the representatives on each group just to confirm that the changes we made were reflective of what the meeting was as a final check. And then that will start to be carried forward into the draft Envision Coeur d'Alene document. So that becomes more of a formal piece of the document. So we're starting to transition into draft plan development. All right, just as a quick reminder about where we've been, we started this project back in September 2019, and we'll actually show some of the trajectory of those results, early results, and how they've been incorporated to today. So we started back in September of 2019 with a public kickoff, where we looked at specific kind of land use vision. We asked people to play a game to place different types of land use within areas, and we actually got to really start thinking about what a vision might be for Coeur d'Alene over the next 20 years. And so if you remember, we started with sticky notes on chart packs and writing down just phrases and words that really kind of epitomize where people think Coeur d'Alene is today, some of the challenges with Coeur d'Alene, but also the opportunity over the coming years. We took that information, came back to you and the focus groups in December to help review and organize those goals and objectives. With the focus groups, we actually cut pieces of paper, moved it around, we added goals, we added objectives to start providing that structure. But with the CAC in December, we looked at the results from that public meeting and actually started to develop some potential concepts for land use and transportation. And so you'll see how those activities that we did in December are translating into what we're talking about tonight. We went back out to this public in January for a public survey. We had about 300 responses, looking primarily at the vision, principles, and goals. So it was a great response. It helped us refine those principles, refine the goals and objectives. We came back in March to you and to the focus groups to start to kind of coalesce what the public was saying, and with the focus group and CAC review, how we start to refine those actions and identify really kind of those marching orders for implementation. We continued to work between March and about June, end of June, to help kind of amend those actions and add that to make sure that existing plans were incorporated into it. And so we went back to the public in July with a public survey. We had about 1,000 responses, which was great. And we asked people to do either one or two things. And there was a choice there so that you didn't have to do each section. But we asked people to review and prioritize the actions, which the focus groups just reviewed and updated yesterday and the day before. But we also asked people to review the land use scenarios and to really start to provide kind of key input on where land use and how land use should be allocated within the city over time. And that's primarily what we're going to be talking about tonight. So this evening, we're going to look at the land use scenarios and the focus groups. They are already done with their job, and we're starting to work with the results of that. So I just wanted to kind of share how much work all of these groups have done over about the past 9 months to get essentially from a game to look at land use and sticky notes on chart packs for vision to actually starting to get to draft plan elements. I think that's really important to show the projection or the trajectory of where we've been and where we are today. So with that, I want to just talk briefly about place types. The place types, these were pieces that were as a part of the original kickoff for the project. And we have 9 place types that are essentially aligned with your existing zoning. And so when we look at scenarios and we move through that, these place types are essentially generalized land use classifications. And one thing that's a bit uncommon with the Coeur d'Alene Comprehensive Plan is that you don't have a land use map, a generalized land use map that helps direct growth throughout the city and within the ACI. And so these place types were what we initially used as a part of the game in September to start talking about land use. This is what we used in December to really start to focus on where these generalized land use classifications might be. And if you look at this, for example, like compact neighborhood, which is number 2, we identify compatible zoning districts that you have within the city. And so those types of zoning, it's essentially saying the compact neighborhood could incorporate a variety of different types of zoning. And so it helps provide general direction when you start to look at zone changes, when you look at additions to the ACI or annexations within the city, for how you can actually address and classify land use. So we have 9. These are focused primarily on residential, going from single family to more urban, which is more apartment, townhome development. There's a lot of talk about mixed use within the public meeting as well as the surveys. And so those are categorized in a couple different mixed use districts as well as downtown, which is very focused within Coeur d'Alene. You have a really unique downtown with a lot of kind of character that's different than in many places in the city. And then also focusing on, also retail, employment, industrial, and the neighborhood centers, which are really kind of those nodes that you would identify at intersections or corners that have that kind of key urban activity for retail, commercial, gathering spaces, etc. So I just wanted to show these because we're going to come back to these in a moment, but they're things that help organize and kind of help create the scenarios as we move into that. So with that, I'm going to stop just for a moment. Any questions at all with that? And where we're at? Is this all sounding familiar from back in September and December? Okay. So let's just talk briefly about the scenarios. So part of this plan was to identify how growth could occur over time within Coeur d'Alene. And the Kootenai Metropolitan Planning Organization, they help kind of plan and project growth, not just for Coeur d'Alene, but for a number of different places. And so when we think about growth targets, we think about the next 20 years out. What could Coeur d'Alene look like over the course of time? And so these numbers are numbers that we actually used with the existing kickoff, or the kickoff back in September. And the medium growth scenario, if you remember, is what KMPO assumes the growth will be within Coeur d'Alene in the next 20 years. So if we have, a current population as of 2018 of about 52,000 people, the KMPO projection is of closer to 85,000. So, a fairly significant amount of growth over time in the next 20 years. Part of that growth target is that it is just an assumption. And so we were curious about what people actually think growth targets should be within the area. And we encourage people to pick a growth target and then to be able to assign land use and employment based on those targets. So we offered a low and a high, which is essentially a bracket of 10% for each of those target for the medium target. And we've been using this as a way to start to identify whether or not Coeur d'Alene actually has capacity within its city limits and its ACI to be able to accommodate, one, that medium growth target. But if you started to look at some of the goals and kind of vision elements that came out of the public meeting of increased walkability, mixed use, the other types of uses, if you start to rethink some of the land use, could you actually want to accommodate more people, but also start to create those spaces that people have told us through the public process that are important to the community. Walkability, access to small scale retail, close to a grocery store, near parks. All of those are key elements that have come out as a part of the public process. So when we think about these growth targets, these apply and respond to some of the scenarios that were developed through the public process. So just some quick pictures. This was our kickoff. If you remember, show of hands who played the game. Remember this? It was a while back. We did this at the Innovation Den, but then the city actually took this out to the community as well too. So there was a number, Sean, I think we had, 20 or so different teams playing this. We had 8 or 9 at the kickoff, but then we had a number of others that would happen throughout the community. So when we think about scenarios, we were actually already developing this at the public kickoff. And I show that because those little tiles that you see on the maps, those are the place types. So people were already applying those place types within the city as we were moving in. We brought that back to you in September, or excuse me, in December with the second CAC meeting. Jessica, I think I see you there helping out, trying to figure it out. Terry, you're in there as well. And that meeting, we took all of the information from that place type and Build a Better Coeur d'Alene game and laid those out on transparencies to start to see where there was alignment on different types of land uses and what the transportation system might look like, both for vehicles, but also for bikes and peds. And the two slides on the right are two concepts that the CAC developed as part of that process. So those scenarios that we've been talking about are actually things that you started working back on in December. All right, so let's show how that translates into actually more the scenario-based software that we use to calculate, capacity and how that starts to work. So we took the information that from the public meeting in September, we took the information from the CAC in December, and that map on the left is essentially just kind of a drawn concept for where land use, for people where the preferences for land uses started to fall on a map. And we developed 3 of those. We looked at more of a compact focus, we looked at a district focus, and we looked at a corridor focus just based on what people's preferences were. There was enough differentiation to be able to have 3 different growth targets. And then we put that into a computer and a scenario planning software tool to start looking at, okay, if we do this, how does it start to fall on the ground? Now, the challenge with this is that this doesn't take into account yet kind of the existing condition within Coeur d'Alene. And so this first step was really just to get from the public process into the tool. And so we continue to refine that. We looked at the existing development patterns within Coeur d'Alene. We looked at different densities. So when we think about employment or housing, it's like where are the nodes that are already occurring within Coeur d'Alene? And so we did some mapping with some higher or lower densities in terms of households, in terms of employment, to kind of get a sense of where some of these places are that already have really strong characteristics for housing and employment. And then we also looked at current zoning. So if we start to apply current zoning, existing land use, some of the density existing density of the development, then we start to refine these maps more in the output, so they start to get a little bit closer to where development might actually occur and kind of where the friends are. If you're looking at certain types of housing, are there areas that you could locate similar housing adjacent or employment areas adjacent? And so we continue to refine that, but it still doesn't quite get to kind of the key piece of where actual development can happen. And so this map is one that, to be honest, maybe it didn't surprise you, but it surprised us a little bit. We looked at vacant lands, and this is back from December, so some of this might have changed a little bit, but we looked at vacant lands within the city limits and within the area of city impact, which is that black line. And what we saw pretty quickly is that there's not a lot of vacant land within the Coeur d'Alene city limits. And so that's the first step, is to look at, okay, where could development occur where there are no buildings or there is no, kind of really anything there to stop future development. And so that's the first part, but then we also like to look at, with that vacant land, are there other places that are like really large parcels with just a garage or a very small building that could potentially be redevelopable? And so when we start to pair that back with a scenario that has a very broad brush kind of stroke for a whole area, when you start to look at vacant land and redevelopable land, it starts to limit where you're looking in terms of actual development. And so we're showing these because these areas and these blue areas are the areas where potential development could likely occur over time. And so I want to just be clear that when we think about scenarios, it's not about broad brush redevelopment. It's just really about specific parcels and characteristics. Like for this example, this is within the city limits. So then we refine a little bit more. So we have that adjusted concept scenario that looked at the zoning, looked at all these, other elements, and then we start to add those redevelopable parcels, which start to, reduce the number of parcels over time, or reduce the number of parcels that are actually either vacant or potentially redevelopable. And you'll see, from some maps, like for example, adjacent to Fernand Lake, that might be vacant, but it's also really steep. So we started to look at environmental characteristics of those as well. So on steep slopes, that's going to be really hard to develop. So we removed parcels within steep slopes for higher scale development. So that's how we develop scenarios. I'm going to stop there and I'll show the results in just a moment. But that's a lot to take in, I know. But I'm curious, are there questions about that? Of how that actually comes to be, some of the thoughts or process that we went through to show that or to do that?
Am I good? Yep. Alex, this is Woody. Two questions came to mind while you were doing all that. The density, the growing it out to 73,000, the medium thing, is any consideration put into the sewer treatment plant, its capacity?
So at this stage, no. So what scenario planning can do, this is purely a growth scenario in terms of what development capacity. The next piece would be, and there are modules that talk about like water usage, wastewater usage, greenhouse gas emissions, which we'll get into when we refine the scenarios. But the next step would be to actually work with the sewer district or the water district to talk about how this development would, what would need to change to support this type of development. And so what we were assuming for each of the scenarios is that median, that median development or that growth assumption, and that's what KNPO is assuming already. And Sean, I believe, is what your water and wastewater systems are already looking at.
Yeah, that is correct. They are also waiting for us to complete our comprehensive plans before they redo their master documents, so they know what to expect through our comp plan.
Yeah, Woody, there'll be a number of outputs with this. Right now, we're just kind of looking at households, jobs, those types of elements, and then we'll get into some more detail, vehicle miles traveled, transit ridership, infrastructure, those types of things as we get into the refined alternatives.
Makes sense. One other question was you were talking about Fernand Hill's steepness and stuff, and is there any consideration on the hillside ordinance? We have a pretty strong hillside ordinance to keep the mountains from being lit up.
And that's one reason why we remove those. Partly the scenarios work because you're looking citywide, and so for steep slopes, if development were to occur, it's going to be at a very low scale, just given the kind of the topography of that. So we actually just remove that. If they are steeper, because it just doesn't make a lot of sense to assume a lot of development on steep slopes, and so to remove those certain areas. And there was a few other areas within the city as well too that we removed. Thanks, Sean.
Quick question. I don't know if it was in there, but how many households do we have currently for the 55,000 people?
Let me look and see. I'm gonna escape out of this. Let me go back. So we don't have, let's see, can everybody see that? We have a current population of about 51,000. Let me look here and see the scenarios, I believe.
To put it into perspective, and I can pull out a calculator and figure it out, we're sitting right around 54,000 people currently as our estimated population. There is about 2.4 in the number of people per households, And in apartments or transitional type of living like that, there's 2.23, I believe. So when you figure that out, it's probably around
20 or 22.
22,000, 23,000 units.
That sounds about right. So even the medium growth target, is it's a large number of additional units and population. Thanks, Jessica. That's a good question. Other questions on the scenarios? And we can talk about the results here in just a second.
I have a question, Alex.
Yes.
On the scenarios, did you include any potential redevelopment in areas that are not vacant? Maybe that, would be older areas that may be redeveloped to more dense housing or?
We did, and so this map here, let me pop this up. So what we looked at, generally what we looked at from a redevelopment standpoint is in single family areas, we only considered developable or redevelopable if they were vacant or they were really large sites. But all of these blue sites are either considered vacant or redevelopable. So if we go back to the previous slide, which was vacant, you see some spaces are just vacant. You can see little kind of tidbits here and there through the city. So we identified those, and we essentially, like for the single family neighborhoods existing, we just assumed with growth that those would just fill in with like types of uses. So if it's single family neighborhoods and it's a large enough parcel, you'd get another house within there. But when you look at the redevelopment portions, and so I think focus on this middle part in particular, with larger, older commercial, you start to see a number of parcels that may have some development on it, but are potentially redevelopable because the land has a much higher value than the improvement on it, which could be a building or something like that.
Okay.
Alex, this is Tom. I got a question.
Yeah.
I'm on the infill housing committee meetings, and maybe Hillary can help with this too, but have you guys talked to them much? Because each meeting we have, we are looking at areas for infill, different styles of homes, duplexes and different variety of products. And so I didn't know if you guys were in communication with them, because, and as I said, maybe Hillary can add in on this, how that's all going to get incorporated. I know it's going to get into the comp plan at some point in time, but I didn't know if you guys were in discussion with, Mike on that stuff.
We have talked a little bit about that. Hillary, you're probably the best person to address that comment.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. That's good to bring up. I just made a note because we have looped in Alex on our work on the core housing code, including that we're doing the transect mapping and kind of looking at areas of the city where it's appropriate for different types of housing product to be located. And so we do need to overlay the two maps with the scenarios and just make sure that we're in alignment. But yes, he's aware of our efforts and we'll make sure it all matches in the end.
Yeah, it's definitely on our radar. We have taken the place types, which Alex has discussed a few minutes ago, and I have given them to Mike Beharry, which is our planner who's working on the quote unquote core. That's the branding of core housing. And so we are looking at place types as well as this potential redevelopment parcels and overlaying that transect map to ensure that they work together at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, Tom.
Yeah. Any other questions on this? All right, so let's talk about some of the results, and I do want to talk about the survey, just some of the results for that, and then I want to actually get into talking about some specific areas in the city to get your input on how we should move forward on specific areas. Let me get out of this, see what's doing here. All right, so let me move forward again. All right. So in terms of the scenario results, we actually are taking a kind of a phased approach with this. And you'll see the scenarios, a number of these parcels are actually painted different colors depending on which scenario we're looking at. So for example, the corridor scenario focused primarily on commercial development, really along the primary transportation corridors, and also some of the vacant properties in the area, but really kind of dialed in just those specific corridors. And when we start to apply the place types, which we had identified through the initial public engagement and the results, we get on the right, what you'll see is population, anticipated population, dwelling units, households, and jobs that could be a part of that. And so that's something that we look at to see, essentially, does this scenario kind of meet KMPO's growth target? And for this one, if you remember, from a population standpoint, the corridor actually focuses on some of these properties, but the densities and the redevelopment opportunities within the corridor scenario are not as great and actually wouldn't meet your targets for what KMPO is suggesting. And then when we go to the compact scenario, which looks at a few more parcels, the compact scenario, the community wanted to look at more of the core area within Coeur d'Alene, look at some of those redevelopment options on those potentially redevelopable parcels, and actually apply a little bit more of a dense land use mix. So if you go from the corridor scenario where we have on the far, the northeast corner with those two parcels where it's primarily single family neighborhood within this one, we look in this one where this is actually more of a mixed use district. So more of a mix of types of housing, some retail or commercial in there. And really the infill with the compact scenario gets away from the single family, except if it's immediately adjacent, and really starts to focus on some of those core areas within the center of the city for slightly higher types of uses. And so for this one, the compact actually anticipates be able to allocate a much higher population, up to 100,000 people with more dwelling units. But this is really kind of the bracket, if you look at the corridor versus this one, thinking about some of the land uses with kind of broadening where redevelopment could occur, you actually do start to get kind of more capacity within the system. And I want to stress too that this is just within city limits. So if you look at areas outside of the city limits and incorporate the ACI, those numbers, particularly for housing, would increase. So even with the corridor strategy, those numbers would increase, but you're also dealing with a lot more steep slopes. You're dealing with natural areas. You're dealing with forested areas, and so your actual kind of amount that you can develop is still rather limited for most parts, except for the western part of the city. So if you look at a district scenario, this is kind of that in between. So this is a mix, like if you look at the northwestern corner, it's a mix of mixed use, which is slightly taller buildings, with more employment focused uses. So that's where we get a slightly higher number of jobs. We still can accommodate KMPO's population growth target, but this district scenario really focuses kind of on the core pieces, but also up and down the US 95 corridor. It looks at some on East Sherman, as well as the 4th Street corridors. And so when you start to think about kind of where development could actually occur and where population centers might be, these are some of the locations that are the most likely to do that. The question is, what type of land use do you assume within those areas? And that's some of the questions we're going to ask you in just a moment. So those are the mapping. Just kind of summarize. Like we look at a base scenario, which is kind of your existing zoning, and then you compare that to the corridor, compact, and the district. Compact obviously provides the most population because it's the densest, but when you compare it to where your existing zoning is, district is still well within that. Compact obviously has a lot, but your base scenario and zoning actually can accommodate some of that growth within city limits. And the same goes with housing type. So for your base scenario, there really isn't a lot of land to develop within city limits, particularly for single family. And so base scenario can provide a few thousand more units than what you have today, based on our back of the napkin calculations. But with the corridor, compact, and district, you definitely get more development opportunity if we start thinking about different land use types within those areas. And the same with households. So the other piece to this, it's not just about housing, it's also about employment. The interesting thing with this, with district and compact, they're actually very close. A lot of this is through mixed use development. So with corridor, we're still focusing more on traditional commercial style of development, but compact and district looks at different types of uses for the employment categories. And so we're still meeting actually CANPO targets for this, but it does focus on different types of commercial uses in this area. So just kind of give you a sense of where these things are starting to fall. All right, before I go into the survey, any questions on that? I know that's a lot to digest. A lot of colors on a map.
Yeah, Alex, I was just, and maybe you answered this with that last slide, but does your software, when you look at like the growth, rate of growth, does it also look at the size of retail areas that will be required for a certain scenario, as well as employment centers, and does it balance it out that way?
Yeah, it will. And so within each of those place types that I had showed earlier, for example, like mixed use, there's assumptions, there's actually growth assumptions within each place type. That could be a number of different mixed uses. That would be, one development type could have 10,000 square feet of retail, with 3 stories of residential on top of that. Or if it's more traditional commercial, we had made some assumptions based on existing development, what those commercial pads might look like and where they would fit. And so the software is able to differentiate between parcel size and development potential. So we know that you're not going to get a Home Depot on East Sherman, for example, because the parcels are too small, and that's not what the land use type dictated. But along the 95 corridor or someplace else, it can actually place some of those if it fits.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions on that? All right, so let's talk about the survey then. I mean, then we're going to get into actually some mapping with the group to help us figure all this stuff out. So with the survey, we took all of this information to the public back in July, as I said, and there was some interesting responses for this. We had the survey live for about a month. We asked them on one side to propose or prioritize proposed actions, as well as identify new actions. That's the policy framework that the focus groups have been working on. But then we also asked them to look at those land use scenarios and specific growth assumptions. And then there was an opportunity to place growth where you wanted to place it based on those general categories that were developed earlier in the project. And I think that's a key piece of this, is that what you'll see in just a moment are actually what the community placed in specific areas within Coeur d'Alene for those who responded to the survey. So in terms of respondents, this is a map-based survey, so we were able to identify actually where people responded from. We asked them to place a pin where they live. And by far the majority of people live in Coeur d'Alene, but this survey is available to anybody who has access to the web. So we also saw a few people from the outlying area, Post Falls, Hayden, Rathdrum. There's a couple from Spokane that may have an interest in the area. But by far the majority of people who responded to this live within Coeur d'Alene city limits. Not surprisingly, and this is really common with surveys, mostly women responded to this. We had almost 600 women respond, and we had about 300 men respond. So that's about normal. I don't know why, but that's always the way it is. And then in terms of age, we actually got a good age breakdown for this. We have a lot of folks who are 35 to 44, people right in the kind of hub of their career, as well as kids. But we also got a number of 25 to 34-year-olds, which is great to see, because that's often a much different response than, say, a 65 plus crowd. So having a good breakdown of demographics was nice to see for this survey. If you did take the survey, we asked 2 different places. We asked, do you want to see both the framework and the mapping? I was a little surprised, to be honest, that people went through the framework. They wanted to see both. So we had an overwhelming response that everybody wanted to do both things, which was great. But then also some people just wanted to place pins as well too. In terms of focus groups, and this was interesting for the framework, there was a very high interest in most all of the specific principles within the policy framework. Health and safety was a little bit lower, but still a high response rate for them. But everybody else, people are very interested in what's happening and want to provide comments on this. In terms of the scenarios, one thing we asked, and this gets back to that earlier question about kind of how to plan and where to plan. If we look back to that first kickoff back in September, we had a lot of people who wanted to plan for high growth, and whether or not it's just going to happen regardless, or we just expect it to happen. By far, the majority of people picked medium or high compared to low in terms of growth. So that helps set their goals for developing the scenarios. Also, too, from which corridor, which scenarios they picked, compact and districts were much higher than corridors. And I think that gets to the walkability questions, kind of ensuring great neighborhoods. Those are things we've heard over and over, and those are the things that the compact and the districts growth concepts show. So it was interesting to see that, and it was supported through the data with this survey and the stuff we've seen in the past. Oh, let's see. So we already got this one. So we talked about that. So compact and districts was by far what people supported. And then what we did, if you did take the survey, you were able to identify where you want it to be. And it was interesting, regardless of what people picked in terms of scenario, people chose essentially very similar areas, which kind of makes our job easy in some ways because we can look at specific areas regardless of location. But if you look at the heat map is essentially where people place the most pins. So you see it along 4th and 5th Street, you see it along the US 95 corridor, certainly along East Sherman, other areas along the river. Those are areas that people really felt were important to consider for jobs. And in terms of different types of jobs, mixed use, retail, employment, some industrial, but really focusing on a little more the glamorous jobs, if you will, for these types of uses. And the same can be said for housing. Many people picked south of Interstate 90 for where their housing was, but again, similar areas. So if we think about employment along 3rd and 4th and along East Sherman, people are picking the same types of locations for housing. And so when we think about land uses, that's a really important consideration. And then also some hubs here and there, a couple along US 95, some along the vacant areas to the northwest as well too. So with that, I'm going to leave these up for a second. Any questions on this? Surprises? Concerns?
Alex, how come some of the known areas of city impact that are outside the current city limit are not factored into this? Because it seems like those will really modify the numbers over the next 10 to 15 years that I'm not seeing factored into any of this.
So what we looked at for this first round of scenarios is just what you could accommodate within city limits. Do you need to expand outside of the ACI to accommodate the growth? The other piece of that is that the areas outside of your city limits, but within the ACI, particularly on the east and south, have a lot of environmental constraints with them. They're steep slopes, they're forested, some are federally owned, and so there is certainly capacity out there, but the capacity is generally pretty low. And so our next step will be to incorporate those areas within the ACI, including some areas to the west that you can see on this map, just up to just north of I-90. We'll be looking at that as a part of the capacity analysis, but we really wanted to see, could you fit this within the city limits? And if you can't, what are some changes you would need to make to do that? Other questions? That's a great question. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah,
Question about, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the heat map does reflect where the pins are, although they're not in such a high concentration based upon the results of the survey to actually get to that yellow and red highlight. So if you do look there, you can see some what look like purple or blue smudges. So the people who took the survey were able to place the pins anywhere on the map.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Sean. So those little like soft purple areas, there might have been points there, but those concentrations of points where you see in the orange and red, that's where you really got a lot more people placing pins. But you know, there were pins all over the city. You're seeing the concentrations in the coloring.
On the jobs part, is there any possible projection on more creation of remote jobs that can be done from home that support local businesses? Seeing where we're at right now, and we're all getting really good at doing Zoom.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's going to be from a scenario standpoint, that's a tough one to be able to do. I mean, because essentially you could, as long as you have a good internet connection, you could work off at any kitchen table within the city. I think what we're looking at here is, are there those kind of key destinations that would be more retail or commercial focused and less office? There is some here like employment centers. We saw some of that, but I think the ones that people are really interested in is more the mixed use and kind of retail centers, and that might be a little bit safer in the next wave of working remotely, because those folks still need to go someplace too, and we can go back into businesses. But that's a great question, Jessica, and that's one that I think pretty much every city is trying to figure out. If you have a lot of office space, what do you do if the leases are coming up and you don't have employees coming back?
You know, that's a great question. Hillary just brought up a wonderful point here, and we're kind of in a new era here where there's definitely some unknowns. And so generally when wastewater models, you know, they do their hydraulic studies and figure out where the wastewater is going, it's, you know, people wake up in the morning, they take a shower, flush the toilet, and lots of water coming our way. And then they get home and they make dinner and they do things like that. So the demand happens, you know, early in the morning and late at night. And it's going to be really interesting to see if a bunch of people start working from home, what those demands end up looking like. Yeah. And is that going to affect these scenarios or not? If people are working from home and there's less demand early in the morning, but a more even constant demand throughout the day.
Yeah, you know, it's a great question. And I think, yeah, that's all something I think we're trying to figure out. It's all unknown right now until how this starts to work itself out. I'm ready to go back to the office. I'm hoping to go back to the office soon, but it is nice to have the flexibility from working outside. Other questions on those scenarios? So, you know, I guess one comment for this, just in general, then we're going to step into an exercise to actually start to dig into some of this data for some specific areas. You know, from the policy, the policy framework and the focus groups, you know, I think one of the kind of key discussion points throughout that was, how do you tie some of these land use results from the survey and the scenario planning into policy as it moves forward, particularly for growth and development, community and identity. I think there's no question that Coeur d'Alene is expanding and changing and growing. And so that was, I think, a question for many of the policy focus groups about the policy framework, is being able to meld the land use with the specific actions moving forward, you know, over the next, you know, several years. So there's a lot of conversation about that because they are definitely linked in how they work together. I'm curious, Jessica or others that were part of those conversations, any additional comments on that, or Sean or Hillary, you as well? All right. So more to come on that. Jeff, to get to your question too, we will be continuing to do scenarios. We'll be looking at the ACI. We'll be looking at areas actually outside the ACI now as a part of the Lakeside Holdings discussion. The other piece for that too is we'll be doing traffic analysis and kind of high-level transportation analysis for each of these scenarios, and we're just starting on that now. So that will be another outcome too, is to say, okay, we have all of this growth. or potential growth, what does that actually do to the transportation system? And then how do you balance that between, you know, vehicles, transit, bikes, pedestrians, all of those specific elements we talked to as well too. So that's another piece that's coming. All right. With that, let's switch gears for a bit. So I'm going to attempt to bring up two different things here. Give me just a second. All right. So I'm going to show, let's see. So we put together, let's see, what is screen one? All right. Did everybody see a map as well as the presentation slides?
Yep.
Yeah, I can see it, Alex. It's Tom.
All right. So we are going to actually work through some of this. So just to kind of orient you, so there are, on the left-hand side, we've taken the place types and broken them out individually so that we can see them and we can reference them as needed. What we've done is we've taken all of the scenario work and they put it onto an online ArcGIS database so that we can actually start to talk about the results of the survey and the scenarios tonight within specific contexts of areas that had a really high kind of concentration of interest. And so just to orient you, this is a map of Coeur d'Alene. The pink line here is your existing area of city impact. The black is your city limits. And then, Julie, these are the blue redevelopable parcels that we showed in the presentation before too. So now remember, the redevelopable will also include vacant parcels, but some have been removed, like cemeteries, steep slopes, others to get to this final redevelopable place. And so what I'd like to do is to actually start talking about specific areas. And we've identified 4 areas within Coeur d'Alene that really received a lot of action on the survey. And so I wanted to step through this and actually get your input on what types of land uses we should consider within these areas. Kind of based on the survey results, but also based on what you think makes the most sense for these areas. Ultimately, we need to get to a preferred alternative, and this is going to help us refine some of those results as we step through. So I'm going to ask for suggestions if there are specific areas the team would like to start with first. We have the 3rd and 4th Street corridor. We have the area along the river. We have East Sherman Avenue, and then we have this kind of northwest corridor as well too. Any place you want to start first?
I'll start off. This is Tom, Alex.
Yes. Where should we go?
In general, what I feel, and I'm talking as far as P&Z goes, and some of the stuff that has come before us as PUDs, I'm thinking we're going to see a slowdown in a lot of single-family PUDs because of the land use that has been done already for single families. What I feel we're going to be seeing more of is, as I mentioned before, the infill housing, the maybe 3-4 story type retail, residential on top type of products in town, and then perhaps some smaller courtyard, as we have talked about an infill, courtyard type of products. I don't think we're going to see a lot of large parcel PUDs because we've already annexed in a lot of our outlying areas. I think along East Sherman and down Lakeshore Drive, again, you're going to see perhaps higher density type of products in those areas, but I just feel everything is going to kind of go up a little bit not so much a single family out that we've seen over the years, because all those pieces of property are being developed now, and as quickly as they can build them, they're being sold. I feel we're going to see a lot more apartments. They're starting one down in Riverstone, and they're all going to be rental units, basically. So I see a lot of products that are going to be kept in portfolios that are going to be rental units, and not in the low dollar figure rental units either. I think they're going to be in the higher figure rental units, much different than what we've have in our older products nowadays that are somewhat lower dollar figures for rentals. And that's my feel that I see is coming.
So let's test that. What I just turned on were 3 different types of housing that from the survey that are consistent with the place type. So there's a compact, urban, and mixed use. So compact is like townhomes, small scale duplex, whereas urban is more apartments, kind of low scale residential, and then mixed use is obviously slightly taller, but with a retail component. So when you look at this, you'll start to see that there's more density from just the survey results in some of these areas. So what I'm wondering, and Tom, kind of getting to your point, when we look at the 3rd and 4th street corridors here, I think we see a couple things that maybe we could explore as a group. One, there's a number of parcels that start to pop up as potentially redevelopable. And so that might be a good location if we start to look at how some of these place types could apply. But then also we can start to look at street intersections. Like, are there specific areas that we want to identify as a node? Like, is this a gathering place, a place that is a place where we could really consider some type of different types of uses? So is it okay if we go into this area? Does anybody have a reason why I wouldn't start with that? All right, I'm going to do it. So I'm going to zoom in. All right, so now for this, and I'll turn this off in just a second because it's a little bit tough to see. And what Lauren is going to be doing as we're talking about this, we can look at some of these place types as they were applied. We can look at some of the parcels. Lauren is going to be adding comments to the map about discussion of kind of where this should go. But just in looking at this corridor, first thing I see is I see a number of potential kind of parcels that have potentially been redeveloped. I see a lot of smaller parcels, but also this area right here is one that the community really had a lot of interest in. And so let's turn these off just for a second so we can see what that looks like. So it's this area right here. Maybe I'll turn on a different base map. So we can start to see what that looks like. So from the group standpoint, if the community is saying we want walkability, we want mixed use, we want different types of uses, and this is commercial right here. Should we think about a different type of land use in here, or a different type of place type that would accommodate some of those uses? Or other places along this area here too.
I guess I got to say one thing just so you know I'm paying attention. It looks like you guys are highlighting the St. Vincent de Paul thrift store as a developable lot.
Which parcel is that?
It's on the corner of Walnut and let me see here.
3rd, right there, between 3rd and 4th.
Government Way.
Am I right there, Sean? Am I off?
That is correct. It's on the east side of Government Way off of Walnut.
Yeah, Government Walnut. You have that right there, right there. That's me, isn't that, Sean? For us?
Yes, I believe that is. I'd have to zoom in and see the footprint, but yes. So
yeah, that is.
Yes, it is.
So you have so I'm glad we started with this one. I think that the reason why, Larry, why this potentially comes up as redevelopable is the improvement value of the building to the size of the site. And so that's typically how these numbers are determined. Doesn't mean that it will redevelop per se, it just looks at as potential opportunity areas. So you'll see it on a number of these spaces where it's not identified as vacant, but there's like this one, for example, it's a warehouse with a large open space. And so the improved value of that building is not as high as what the planned value is, at least according to the assessors.
Yeah, that's Rungy Furniture, just for everybody's info.
Yeah, and it looks like Sean Goodwill is also identified. So Alex, you've answered my question.
Yeah, and so I think the question with this, and we can, certainly it's parcel specific, but more broadly, there is a desire to kind of create spaces that are more walkable and usable and for pedestrians. And these types of areas certainly provide services, no doubt. I think the question to the group is, as we start to think about, 20 years from now, and as Tom, as you said, as growth starts to occur, where should that growth happen? And some of it will be on vacant land, but a lot of it could actually be redeveloped property throughout the city. And so this is a question for us as a team, as a CAC, to actually start to think about how that might occur over time and what are the right uses for that.
Alex, and I just got another comment. We have to look at, what the existing zoning is on some of these. I mean, if you're C17 in, let's say, any of these larger parcels where St. Vinny's is or any of those, as you can see right there, and someone comes in and does decide to do something, and we're on the other side saying, hey, we want some lower density mixed use, that's great. But if the zoning stays what it is, as you know, by zoning rights, someone can come in at C17 or an R3 or whatever that zoning is and do kind of what's allowed. And
well, and Tom, that would be the next step for this, is the place type. The place type, helps align zoning to urban form. And so, one of the questions for this is like, is the zoning, is C17 the right type of zoning for this area? So when we think about place types and we think about mixed use, those are not necessarily consistent with a large scale commercial development. And so, if we start to think about land use a little bit differently within the city, are there areas that we should start to think about more as kind of districts or nodes as opposed to just kind of general commercial?
It seems to me like this area is right on the cusp of either becoming commercial and it's going to push out that residential that's in there, or some of those residential pockets need to be carved out and have some more mixed use with activity centers to redevelop that and give those people a sense of community in there. Because we know that some of our lower income properties that are sitting next to commercial buildings and spread throughout in that area.
So, Jeff, are you saying that, so for this, you're saying that development would actually happen within the single family residential as opposed to commercial?
Well, it feels like it would push the single family out, because I think the values of your single family residences are going to go down in that area. And I would say they're probably already lower income in that area from what I know, where we have kids that come to school scattered throughout those. And so if it continues to be commercial that develops in through there, I think the values of those homes are going to go down unless there's improvement in those areas that create these nodes that give them sense of community and belonging and areas to congregate and services in those areas.
So Jeff, kind of following up with that question, if we're looking at a place type, and we go back to kind of the community input around, this is an area that people identified with those types of uses. Should we consider, applying that place type to these areas? With single family residential, I think the other question is what's the transition between, kind of higher density development versus single family? A lot of these sites were identified as well because they're a little bit larger. From a development standpoint, single family residential is really hard to develop, one, just from community challenge for that, but also the parcels are often very small. And so if we look at these areas from a broader perspective, we're seeing larger parcels that potentially have opportunity over time, and that's why those single family parcels don't come up, just because they're smaller. So Jeff, how do we get to that? How do we get to that kind of question that you were asking about?
Well, it seems to me like it's at that cusp. Like if that goes more and more commercial in those areas that have the potential for more development, now you've got this commercial space mixed in with these single family existing homes. But if it does redevelop more to a mixed use with activity centers built into it, and the nodes where they have the resources and support that they need, then I think you're starting to give more purpose and value to that region and the people that are already existing live in there.
So is an intervention to actually develop implementation measures to make those areas more mixed use?
Right.
And would that be, because existing, Sean, correct if I'm wrong, but the existing commercial wouldn't allow something like that, is that correct?
C17 is pretty open. The only thing it doesn't really allow is industrial. Okay. So it's mixed use ready already right now.
Okay.
Right.
There are some limitations though for residential only, like single family would still need to meet the minimums for lot size and frontage, and multifamily has a maximum of 45-foot height. But if you get to 51% floor area of commercial, the sky's the limit.
So maybe we should move into a different area then. So what I'm hearing is that this area is fine the way it is. Is that true?
I just wanted to quickly chime in. This is Charles, sorry. I think, the southern end of that is kind of the Harrison divide, which was always, as people come in and they want to be in Coeur d'Alene, they want to be south of Harrison, and there's nothing left south of Harrison really. And I think we're seeing already that that's being invaded by new people coming in, and like it or not, as those growth, the projections show, we are going to have new people come in, and there's going to be a increase in population. So I think that's an area in particular that's going to really be seeing a lot more people living in there, probably in more multifamily type units that, people will put up. There's a couple of them on 4th that have just gone up on small lots, but they're 3 or 4 or 5, units. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So I'm thinking, I agree with you, Jeff. Right now, that's what probably we need, and the character of that space. But I think it's going to change pretty dramatically quickly.
Charles, are there specific, thinking about nodes? If Harrison is the dividing line, and we're looking at 3rd and 4th, are there nodes along that corridor that you see development occurring, or different types of uses that we'd want to identify through the plan to really focus on? Like, for example, Harrison and 4th, it's...
I suspect that it's going to develop from the south to the north.
Okay.
And, just as you can really walk to downtown, and the south end of this is, it's Midtown, but that's a stone's throw from downtown. So I think I see it just going, it's kind of falling over like dominoes from south to north.
And do you think that from, I'm just probing, because I want to make sure that as we think about place types through here, the development that's occurring, do you think it gets to what the community has said that they want in terms of development types, whether it's walkable or mixed use or varied? How is that developing today versus what the community is saying they want to see in this area?
I mean, others probably know better than I think the downside is that things are bloody expensive.
Yeah.
But I do think that area is just kind of inherently, neighborhoodish. There's slow streets and nice you can, instead of walking down 4th, you can choose 5th, and it's, you know, much nicer, and, you know, you're not going to get run over, and, you know, that kind of thing. So I think there is good walkability, there's good access, you know, at least via car to freeway, to downtown, etc. So biking is pretty easy in that space. I don't know, others maybe have a different idea. I kind of live down, you know, to the south and east a little bit, but I spend a fair bit of time up in there.
Well, and I hear what you're saying, like adjacencies to the neighborhoods. So if scale were an issue in this area, it would need to be able to transition into neighborhoods. So still that walkability is important, but there's also a scale question in this location.
Alex, another statement, and Sean and Hillary can weigh in on this as well. We, as far as planning and zoning, we approved, I think, 2 or 3 projects already in that 4th Street corridor from Harrison area down south, and they just haven't started the projects, maybe because of what's going on right now, but we've already approved a few types of commercial underneath and some little residential above. And Sean, if you want to weigh in on that as well. So I agree that area is going to be that type of product. That's my comment.
Yeah, I can agree with that. We've seen, for example, like Pepper and Duffy Smock are doing some construction in Midtown right now. And so I think what we're seeing, at least from my perspective, is that the local developers see the urban exodus and what's going on in some of these larger cities, and they're marching forward with their projects where the larger conglomerates, the big hotel owners and things of that have put nationwide their products on hold. And so we're getting the kind of the split is what I'm seeing, where the locals can see it happening locally and they're moving forward, and some of these bigger companies are pulling back. And so, to kind of connect the dots there between Jeff's comments, Buck's comments, and let's see, Tom's comments, is how best to put this is, the land is bloody expensive. I heard that came loud and clear. And so when these developers start looking for product that they could build, they first start looking for vacant property. And so to get these products to pencil that already have units or other development on them, they're going to have to increase that density to make it work. And so, putting words in Alex's mouth here for a second, but that's where you start to see that mixed use activity centers and things like that start to happen, is because they need that floor area and those units to make it work financially.
Yeah, a quick comment if I could. When we're talking about north of Harrison, that little kind of, I call it infill area, all those little homes back up in there that somebody mentioned that thought they weren't appropriate or they would eventually go away. If you do some historical perspective of that area, that was kind of the downtown. That's where the Albertsons was. That's where Safeway, the grocery stores, that's where the little shops and things, that area. Now, most of that has gone out. They've gone kind of north and then back into town. But I always think those quiet streets north of Harrison, 1st Street, 2nd Street, with Government Way on one side, 3rd and 4th are kind of arterials in a certain way. But those are some pretty unique little areas, and every once in a while you see somebody fixing something up, or like they do down around Garden and stuff, they scrape it. They buy it, they tear it down, and they max it out, go for it. So I think that particular area, I live a little south of there, but it's unique because everything's somewhat close by, and whatever happens development-wise, if it intensifies probably with mixed use, and the shops and stuff. I think something that I do is, just as a business guy, is mixed use with apartments on top of retail is all groovy and stuff. It's the retail that has to survive. And it's easy to build buildings, but something else for somebody to come in and run a business and make rent and be successful, to kind of fill out the good feeling behind all that. And the way small businesses are right now, it's a little lean and tough. You have to come up with some unique ideas, and it seems like we're getting saturated with the same thing over and over again. And I guess maybe that's where population becomes an important part of the growth and balance of business, because small business isn't like big business. It's not like government. It's not like corporations. It's little individuals, you know.
Well,
Sorry, I went off.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I think the question, so what I'm hearing for this area is that from a mixed use standpoint, it needs to occur organically. And I apologize. I think the kids let the dog down in the basement, so I'll go get rid of him in a second. The scale, C17 zoning generally, this area could develop as mixed use. Under current, there's not, where people want to see this, that it could occur over time, that there's not an intervention that CAC would recommend as a part of this process to actually be able to do that. I think that's the question. The challenge that we have as an advisory group is, from a land use standpoint, are we aligning land use with partially with market resources, but also with where population, or the types of design that the community wants to see? Is this getting to that question? And I think this group, I'm hearing that it's gonna happen over time, and that it's already there. But I just want to make sure before we move to another spot that we don't need to make any changes in this area.
Yeah, Alex, this is Meredith.
Jessica, you're
I would just really quickly add that I think that what you said is true for south of Harrison. So the areas that are highlighted, I believe, is the space next to Safeway on 4th. And so I think there's a lot of walkability and sort of already a node naturally forming there. I'm not sure if that's true north of Harrison. So I would say that this area could kind of almost be looked at as almost two separate areas, because the area south of Sherman or south of Harrison has already started to develop its own identity and is very walkable. There's shops, restaurants, and a supermarket right there.
Jessica, you had a comment as well.
A lot of what she just said kind of just applies. I know that area on 4th Street, when it comes to like a community point of view, it is very walkable. I think that's where locals, for a lot of people, that's like the Sherman, really, in some ways, where you feel like you can go and hang out and have a nice meal at an independent restaurant and go shopping, and the grocery store. So I just would like to see whatever happens in this area, that character remains and just continues to develop, and not get commercialized.
All right, let's move on. We've got another half hour, so we have time to step through some of these others. Let's go over to, let's talk about East Sherman. Obviously an area that has had a lot of interest recently. So let me just turn on I want to start to look at some of these. Which one? I want the density one. That's one. So I got too many choices here. All right. When we start to look at kind of the layering from the community survey, it's interesting in looking at this where there's definitely a focus kind of on the east side of Sherman in terms of different kind of housing types. And I think particularly when you get into here, this is an area that has, I think, generally small parcels. When we look at redevelopment, it's challenging because there are not, just everything is broken up into smaller chunks. So if there were development were to occur, it would happen on a much smaller scale or would require lot consolidation. But it's also an area that's burgeoning in terms of kind of place, and a place that I know the city and the community is really kind of focused on in terms of development. So I wanted to just talk about this a little bit for what we think about in terms of future land use for East Sherman. And we can look at the zoning on it, existing zoning. It's general commercial across that first layer of parcels, and then it gets into single family behind that. And Sean and Hillary, I'm wondering, would you maybe speak to East Sherman just a little bit in terms of kind of the stuff that both the city or CDA 2030 has been working on in this area?
Sure, yep. So I think that's great to kind of help provide perspective in case not everyone has been tracking our efforts. So the city and CDA 2030 have been working together to engage the community on a vision for East Sherman. And so we have a draft revitalization plan that shows how the area could revitalize and redevelop. And a lot of it is adaptive reuse because of, as you mentioned, there's, not a lot of large parcels and just the block sizes and half blocks. It's pretty constrained with the alleys. So we have anticipated that there would be mixed use, some kind of the compact and urban types of housing scattered along there. We're looking at probably 45 feet would more be kind of anticipated just on the main corridor, just because of, again, the constraints of the parcel sizes and parking and all of that. Reduced setbacks, things like that is what we're looking at for the main commercial corridor, and really just going one block north, one block south, and not interrupting the residential areas too much. Nicole, anything you want to add?
I think we lost her. Nicole had to take off for her other meeting, I believe, so I think we lost Nicole.
Anything you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to add from a zoning standpoint, when you pulled that up, there's the commercial C17 that runs right along Sherman and at most of the way down East Sherman at what Hillary was describing, the alleyway, there's R17, which is a multifamily zone. But most of the development that actually exists now is single family in those areas. And so just because you zone it for something doesn't necessarily mean that they will come. So those little tiny parcels and lots of really cool single family houses that have been fixed up over the years, I don't necessarily see some of that going away unless, like Alex pointed out, that you can tie together a number of lots and then do a larger product. So Hillary is correct. Most likely this is going to end up being very small, niche boutique style commercial development with units scattered along.
And you guys, I think from a community standpoint, that's kind of the cachet that everybody likes on East Sherman. It's a destination for many, and it's also a walkable area for the local residents.
Yeah, it's much more authentic, and that's what we've heard from, the millennials and younger, is that they would rather pay more money and have an authentic experience than go and get a corporate dish of whatever that they're handing out from a corporate level.
And Sean, I think residents in that area are willing to do a little commuting, and are not necessarily looking for workplace hubs in that area.
I think, Larry, it's an interesting question. I think it was, who it was, Jessica, maybe, about when we look about the scenarios, will more people be working from home? I mean, we're already seeing a lot of urban areas, when the coffee shops were open, people were flocking to these types of areas to actually work, not necessarily in an office, but kind of in those urban environments. So I want to get back to kind of Hillary's kind of description of East Sherman, and from a zoning standpoint or a place type standpoint, this was obviously an area that the community really focused on, just in terms of kind of increasing that vibe like the East Sherman plan talks about. Are there specific considerations that we should think about for the comprehensive plan that would apply to East Sherman, either from specific intersections, types of land use, things that this could help support that overall planning effort?
Could you go out to the north, kind of no man's land?
I'm sorry, what were
So it was fascinating me up there, trying to figure out what that's going to be.
Northwest of East Sherman?
I know up on the other side.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I think we'll do that next.
I guess any other comments on East Sherman?
Woody was actually inquiring about a different polygon, but I think you had a standing question about what people would like to see on East Sherman, so we'll let people speak.
Yeah, just kind of going back to the public input on it.
Alex, this is Tom again. I think I've always looked at East Sherman as similar to 4th Street. And 4th Street, I think, is starting to pick up. And I think East Sherman is going to take a while. And as Hillary mentioned, over the years, a lot of neighborhood input, which has been great. It's going to take one project to really kickstart, I believe, that area, whether it's a 2-story residential, assume commercial, or a 3-story, depending on, as we mentioned, the size of properties to do that. As you and Hillary and Sean, you can touch on this as well. On Coeur d'Alene Lake Drive, there's been development on there, and there's plans for future developments, down the road. I think that area just around the corner from Sherman on Coeur d'Alene Lake Drive is kick-starting a little bit of the area of East Sherman by the freeway. And I think that area might be developed a little bit sooner than the areas closer to downtown Coeur d'Alene on East Sherman. It's just going to take some projects. And there have been some, projects that have been built and have been successful. I think we're going to see a little bit of a turnaround on the southern end of East Sherman starting. That's my comment.
And I think that's, maybe that's where the community was starting to gravitate towards in those areas, like you were talking about, Tom. Let's
Alex, on that, while we're just in that area, so it is good for the group to be aware. So those you have identified in kind of the teal color, those vacant parcels. So kind of the group on the left side, yep, that's owned by Hagedon. So that's associated with the golf course. So there is a request coming forward to Planning Commission on that for some apartments, condo units, and some floors with hotel rooms. Across from that to the slightly northeast, there's a brewery that's proposed. And so hopefully that group will move forward. And then the other parcel south of that is vacant, but in Fernand's city limits.
All right, so that's just, I think
those do have potential for development, obviously, because they're all currently vacant.
Here real quick too is, as Alex mentioned earlier, large parcel development is a lot easier to put together when you're looking at a bigger project. And that's where we see those larger parcels is down there. And so the development is starting to bookend. We already have a beautiful, robust downtown. And now we're seeing closer to the freeway that's got a lot of interest in it. And then it's just a matter of time for all those books in the middle, which is East Sherman, start to pop and start to build out.
Yeah. Well, and if there's that much development action happening there, yeah, and it's interesting seeing the community input here. Is really it's this area where people see that kind of future development happening, or that more mixed use type of walkable kind of urban residential. All right, we have a few more minutes. Let's look at some other, unless there's other questions on East Sherman.
I think Woody had a request to take a look at the northwest area.
This one up here.
Yep, thank you.
All right, so let's look at this. So this one actually had some housing, or excuse me, some employment as well too. So I'm going to turn some of that on to show kind of specific areas, like more kind of retail focused, jobs often also with mixed use. So we start to see these little hubs start to pop up in through this area, and then employment center. So interesting, like just from the concentrations, people are definitely looking at these two spaces. And industrial, a little less so, but actually a little less so, but it's more spread along this corridor. So definitely seen as an employment area. Let me turn these off real quick so we don't layer this up too much. But also when we look at housing, we see those same areas really start to pop up with different types of housing as well too. So definitely interest in this corridor, but a little bit more of a variety compared to the other two that we've looked at, both from kind of a residential standpoint as well as an employment standpoint. So what are you kind of getting to your, what area would you like to look at in here? What are your thoughts on this northwest corridor?
I was thinking about that one up against Hutter Avenue, Hutter Road, which is that top piece, right?
Yep.
The dark blue.
Top two pieces, yeah.
it's kind of like, I was thinking that as no man's land out there because it's sort of, a lot of it is somewhat south is still undeveloped. And we've got the industrial, we call it the industrial center there off of Atlas. When you had that laid out that way, I had never looked at it that way before, that area. It always seemed, it was developed all the way to Prairie of Atlas, but now I'm seeing this big hole over on the left there. What is that? Okay, it is.
Subdivision. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a subdivision known as the Trails.
Yeah, so we can turn on that. So that's subdivision all the way around. Let me turn off this here for a second just to show. And there's some vacant spaces in there, and then this is vacant for the time being here.
But there's PUDs that are approved in there, aren't there?
Sean, Hillary?
Explained to me that it's coming from the north Prairie and slowly creeping down there. That's still like open fields. There's not a lot of that left, but it's slowly filling in with suburbia there.
And these ops, you can see. Yeah, so there's obviously some future development happening right in that area. So I'm curious, the group's thought, so when we looked at kind of the third and fourth corridor, we looked at East Sherman, definitely more focused on kind of residential mixed use type of uses. This is more of a mix in terms of employment, and certainly like Industrial Ave, Industrial Way through here. There are vacancies through here that have been identified, but this corridor is much more diverse, at least from a community perspective, or potential to be more diverse from a community perspective. It looks like it's a little more limited though, with single family, federal. That's federal.
Yeah, that little skinny spot there, to the north, right?
Up here?
Down, go south, and then, right through there. So there's a bike trail that runs right through the middle of there. And to the south is the industrial park. To the north is a foundry and a bunch of buildings there that are most likely going to change. They're in the county right now, but I know Mr. Hearn has some lofty goals for his property there. But that one triangle piece is a gun range, and it's been there for a long time. It doesn't necessarily create the best of neighbors, but it was there way before the houses were. And so I would imagine that's going to be one of those pieces where the dirt becomes more valuable than the use, and most likely will change at some point.
So from the group's perspective, to me, like this was an area that was definitely of interest to the community, but kind of just looking at the existing development pattern, this is federal property right here. Many of these areas are already developed with existing single-family residents. I don't know that, are there changes that we would want to look at in this area from a place type? Because this is pretty. I mean, this triangle might change over time. This is the parcel you were talking about, Sean. That's the foundry.
Correct. To the north, yeah, right where you're. Yep.
So maybe in there. But it's almost like the existing uses aren't gonna, like if you're looking for redevelopment, this may not be the place that people are gonna be going to. Is that fair?
Maybe this is a question for Sean or Hillary. Can you talk a little bit more about that federal land? I mean, it seems odd that there's this federal land carved out right in the middle of the city, and again, almost talking about the gun range. Is that going to become such valuable property for future development and growth that the federal government will want to resort to liquidate that, or what do you foresee with that?
That is one of the biggest wild cards in the city. The federal government can do what they want to with it at some point, and so we just don't know. Another one is the fairgrounds area. I know there's a lot of love and support for that area, but at some point, does it become so valuable that it makes sense to move the fairgrounds out into the county where land is less expensive. Like, we'll see. Time will tell.
On the nursery piece as well, they just invested quite a bit of money on their new office building that's kind of shared. So on the east side of that generally.
Yep.
And they do use the property to grow trees. That's why it's the nursery site. So Sean's right. I mean, we have no idea. They could at some point sell it off for development. It's prime location for sure.
Well, and I think this is actually listed as federal property. Is that true? Or is it?
It is. It's Forest Service.
There was a time, probably in the last 10 years, that there was talk about it coming to the city, and the city would do some type of park. I can't remember it all, but it did come through. I mean, we were trying to be good friends with the feds, which is about relationships and timing. And so I thought we were working on that. And they were kind of talking about a plan. What would you do with it? How would you manage it? How would you salvage it? But it kind of gave Atlas a new perspective, as I remember, because Atlas is getting ready to be brought up to date, I guess. It's an old country road is what it was before the annexations caught up with it and went by. So that was sort of the key kicker for Atlas to be developed was, oh, wow, if we can get that dirt and turn it into a cool park and an open space and all that feel-good stuff, you know. I remember that. It's probably in the last 10 years. I mean, John, you probably remember that, don't you?
Yeah, that's right, Woody. It's the nursery, but it isn't being utilized the way it used to be. They had a tree on every square foot out there, but now they're doing some research, genetic work, and so forth, and they did relocate the supervisor's office out there, and the BLM, and I think the Corps of Engineers. But that's just a small piece of that one corner over there. I know Jim Markley, who was always interested in that because they had 2 high-producing water wells on that property. So, but there's been a lot of talk. Yeah, there was talk about a veterans cemetery and park and just a lot of other uses for it. But it is a prime piece of ground there.
It's right in the middle of things for sure. Connie, I just want to, you had a comment on a property that Woody was talking about, and that's up in this area, is that correct? Or you were saying there's an approved subdivision in City Park. Is that, just so we can close that loop, is that?
Yes, actually, I just wanted to point out that on the north and the south side of the trail is the trails plat, and then the portion just on the north side of that was replatted into the enclave, which is a PUD, which has been approved, and then there also is a city park on the south side. So I'm sending a graphic over to you, Alex. I tried to paste it in the chat, but I can't do that. But Alex, just for everyone's awareness, the city and Alex, we were talking about this last week, and they had requested clarification on what was there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so these are our approved subdivisions and communities.
Great.
And city parks.
Thanks, Connie, appreciate it.
Okay.
So we have just a few more minutes. I just want to touch on this other piece of property. Down near the river, obviously a big development. There's been a lot of stuff happening in this area. This one is interesting when you look at it. So there's a number of kind of property into this area. From a community standpoint, there was pretty much a little bit of everything that people wanted to see within this location. Whether it was mixed use or commercial, retail, this entire location, people really wanted to see this. I guess I'd summarize as a very active, but a diverse mix of land uses through that area. And so, Sean and Hillary, is that consistent with kind of current thoughts on that? Is there something that we should think about from the land use standpoint for this project to be able to push that forward?
So the activity, I think, is consistent with the approved PUD for Atlas Waterfront Project. And then to the west of Atlas is River's Edge, approved PUD subdivision. They just did a slight revision to that. That's still in kind of the approval in between the appeal, in the appeal process, to do a land exchange. But that whole area, yes, I think how people mapped it is consistent. I wouldn't see that we need to change the mapping on this.
Okay.
We did wonder, well, a couple of things. Sean was pointing out that it would be great to get Cookie's perspective on things, and the tribe does own some land just northeast of this area that's outlined. And then I also thought, I know we don't have a lot of time, but the health corridor is another one that didn't get outlined that I think does need to see some place types added to fulfill the vision of the master plan.
So maybe, Cookie, do you want to, do you have kind of thoughts on what Hillary was asking? Then we can move over to the health corridor as well briefly. Hillary.
I'm having a hard time unmuting myself. I don't really have thoughts on it yet. It's really undecided for the tribe as far as that parcel of land. I know that, you know, the school district has approached the tribe, and I also know that, you know, that there have been a lot of businesses that have approached the tribe for selling it. But at this point, I think the tribe's just going to be holding on to it for a little while.
Cookie, can you point out which parcel we're talking about here? So.
I'm kind of a little bit
It's northeast of where you're at right now, so.
It's up on Ramsey.
Yeah.
See where Appleway does that kind of whip up?
Just to the right under your left.
To the left, to the north.
There,
right?
yeah,
Right
that
there.
area.
Right there.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Don't let me drive. All right. All right. Well, we had just a couple minutes. Hillary, do you want to talk about the health corridor or health districts quickly?
Sure. So the area, and yeah, if you can kind of just zoom in a little bit south of I-90 and the Northwest Boulevard, and it goes down to Davidson and east to Government Way. So there's a master plan approved to help with redevelopment of the area around Kootenai Health. And some of the uses that are anticipated are to preserve the established single-family neighborhoods, but add some additional residential that's compatible. But then in kind of the heart of the district to allow mixed use, to have more restaurants, to have apartments, have some hotels, things like that. So I think this is an area where it could be beneficial, and it'd be interesting to see the survey results that you received to see what was placed there. Of course, employment center, we anticipate seeing a lot more jobs develop in that area.
Yeah, certainly employment through this area. Retail came up. Mixed use was in there too. This was kind of we want everything in here. So people were placing stuff all over. So we could certainly look at that. And as we're starting to kind of refine those place types, see what fits with that vision. I think that's going to be true for like the Atlas side and East Sherman and some of the others, is to make sure that that kind of the vision is aligned with that land use map as we move forward. And Sean, we can share this ArcGIS file with you. It has everything in there, so you guys can play around with it.
That'd be great. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions at all? I know this is kind of a tough. It's a lot of information. We're talking about citywide issues in terms of growth and development. These are kind of hard concepts. When we start to get into kind of thinking sort of about parcels, but really kind of pulling out a little bit more and being a little bit more broad. So I appreciate the patience stepping through this. But one thing we wanted to do is to, start to look about how some of the public input and the scenarios actually play out on the ground, and then how we can refine those. And so certainly the information we talked about today will help us do that as we get into some deeper refinement, and then eventually develop that land use map that supports the kind of the community desire for growth over time. Let me talk just briefly about next steps. People are probably hungry, ready for dinner. we are going to continue to refine this. Jeff had a question about, from the scenario standpoint, where we're going with that. We're going to be doing full scenarios for the entire ACI. What I had showed you tonight was focused primarily on within the city limits, just to show you a sense of kind of where growth could potentially occur in the city, how we could accommodate that growth, and then we'll continue to look outside the ACI. We're also going to take another step further out and look at the lakeside holding properties on the west side, on the west side of the future Hutter bypass. That'll also be another series of scenarios. All 6 of those scenarios will have some transportation analysis with them. So we'll start to see at a high level how growth affects the transportation system, but also how it affects the housing and employment balance throughout the city. And I expect those will be done in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And then essentially we're getting into the draft plan. So we are starting to write those draft plan elements. The focus groups did a great job over the past 2 days really refining that component of the draft plan. So in the fall, we'll be coming back with the draft plan, with place types, with that final analysis, and then starting to talk about implementation. Our goal is to still adopt at the end of 2020, but with some of the additions and some of the scenarios, we may be getting into early 2021, but we're still targeting to have the document ready in the fall and winter of 2020 to start to consolidate all of the information we put together with you and the focus groups in the community over the last 9 months. So a lot of work's happened. Now we just got to get it into the plan. Any questions at all? I know that's a lot tonight. I appreciate the time. Kind of thoughts as we close out?
Will there be one more meeting for this group, or I forget how many meetings we committed to at the initial start of this project?
Yeah, Sean and Hillary, I think that's something we should talk about. Initially we had planned for 4, and this is our 4th, but I think it'd be great to come back to you to be able to show some kind of the draft elements, and it might not be a final draft plan, but be able to show kind of what this is. At worst, we can certainly do it through email too. Sean, you were going to.
Yeah, I was just going to say it would feel a little disjointed, I think, if we were not to bring this back to you guys in a more of a draft form, so you can take another look at it and provide that final feedback to us before we bring it up the ladder.
Yeah, I don't think we've quite gotten far enough with it yet, so we're going to make this up through another meeting, I think, to step through these pieces.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? All right, well, before we close it out, I wanted to just say, if, again, this was a lot. If there are questions or comments, concerns, thoughts, kind of after you've, gotten through this information, feel free to reach out to myself, to Sean or Hillary, or to Nicole if you do have questions. As this process moves forward, we're happy to answer or talk about any of the stuff that we've covered tonight. We did record this meeting, so this will be available if you wanted to kind of go back and step through pieces. But we can also provide the presentation as well too, so that you can have it if you want to review and look at things in more depth. But with that, Sean and Hillary, any closing comments?
I would just like to say thank you to everybody. It's been quite a trip so far, I guess. We've had a few pretty rough months, but we have made it through. We're still working towards getting back to normal, and it shows the strength of our community and the ability for everyone to come together to pull something like this together and pull off.
Thank you so much. It's a August advisory committee meeting in August takes commitment, and so we appreciate everybody who came tonight. For the rest of the summer, enjoy yourselves. Make sure you get outside and enjoy the sun. We'll be back in touch in the next few weeks to be able to provide more information and then talk about those draft plan elements as they start to come together. So thank you so much for your time, and with that, have a great night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.